Hi, welcome to the True Mass Games YouTube channel. In this episode of GM Musings, we are doing a little bit of a thought experiment. And we are talking about what happens to a fantasy world when you introduce magic to it. Especially if you introduce high magic to it and a lot of it. Now, stick with me and you will realize very soon that we're talking about a spiral. Something that's becoming bigger and bigger and getting out of control. Magic is, well, the power to shift and change reality around you using the strength of your will and your mind. Not surprisingly, probably, for most of you, would be hearing if you introduce such a power into your world, and if that world is realistic and follows an inner world logic, if it is a world of verisimilitude like we've spoken about in the last GM Musings video from last week, it would not surprise you that such power will shake the very foundations of your world. And that's what we're talking about in this little thought experiment in this week's video. The traditional sort of European-centered, medieval-ish fantasy world would change with the introduction of high magic, and it would change to something that would be hardly recognizable for most of us. Because we, and by that I mean authors and game masters and such, do not want that. We don't want to have a world that is so exotic and that is hardly recognizable. There is kind of a genre convention, so to speak. That is to say that we tend to ignore the logical effects of introducing magic, especially high magic, into our worlds. Some other authors say if the magic is extremely rare, it would not have these strong effects, or if the magic has very nasty side effects, if the using it is extremely dangerous for the mage and for his environment, then it would not be used very much, and therefore it would not have these strong spiraling effects that we will talk about in just a second. In this video we'll see how magic affects the world, and we will also see which types of magic are especially well suited to have strong effects on society and the world as a whole. Hopefully this will give you some inspiration, as I said, to make maybe changes to your worlds or to come up with new ones that are introducing and using some of the ideas we're talking about here. This should go without saying, but I still want to mention it. The more readily available magic is in your world and the cheaper its use is, the stronger will its effects be. So in all these examples that we will be talking about in a moment, we will be assuming the extreme. We'll be assuming magic that is both readily available, either because there's a lot of mages around, or because of those that are around are extremely powerful, and also magic is fairly cheap, so you don't need like a whole ton of gold that just disappears into thin air every time you cast a spell. Alright, so let's jump into it. The very basic thing every society needs, of course, is food and drink. And we'll talk about this very basic thing first. In a lot of fantasy worlds, magic can create food and drink, or it can enhance the creation of food and drink. Often that sort of magic isn't considered particularly powerful because it doesn't have very strong direct like combat effects and such. That means that the spells that do that are fairly low level. But think about it. If such magic is readily available, how would that change society? First, the thing we have to ask ourselves is, if that magic is so common, what happens to farmers? If a mage can enhance a field in a way that only one farmer can produce as much food as 100 farmers could without the magic, or if a mage can actually create food out of thin air, like summon it and just create it, pop it into being, into existence, what happens to the farmers? They are no longer of any use, right? So in the fantasy medieval European-ish society we talked about, that is sort of the foundation of a lot of fantasy worlds, most people are farmers. Like 90%, maybe even 95%, depending on the society, are farmers, because you need that many people to feed the city dwellers, the knights, the soldiers, and so on, everyone who isn't a farmer, basically. But in a world where magic is so prevalent and where it can create food, You wouldn't need that many farmers. So what would all these farmers be doing instead of farming? Well, maybe they would go into the cities. Maybe they would start becoming craftsmen. Maybe they would start using their brains more now that they have a bit more leisure, I suppose. They don't have to fight for the survival of society because the wizards, the mages, are taking care of the food and the drink. In fact, we have a very little known, weirdly enough, example of this in our history, in the history of Europe, that is, when Fernando Pizarro and his conquistadores brought back potatoes from South America. Before that, potatoes were unknown anywhere outside of the Americas, and the potato, being a fairly nourishing vegetable that doesn't need a lot of effort to grow it, allowed many people that were farmers before, that needed to be farmers when we mostly had wheat in Europe, allowed them to go to the cities and do other things. And some historians actually think that this is one of the deciding factors that kickstarted the whole Renaissance, the whole revolution of thought and technology that made the world into that what we have today. Without the potato, that might not have been possible, because many people, instead of thinking and creating, would have remained farmers. And this magic we are talking about, to come back to our actual topic, would have potentially a very similar effect. The second type of magic we'd like to talk about is healing magic, of course. And healing magic going that far that some of the most powerful healers might even be able to raise the dead. Now, how would that affect society if that magic is readily available? Firstly, people would live much longer lives. Mortality of babies would be much lower. People would not die with accidents, with diseases, with infections and such, as they did for many, many, many centuries over the course of our human development. With that healing magic, people would live much longer. Especially rich people who could afford to have a mage, a healer at their disposal. They would basically become nearly immortal. After all, they're not afraid of an assassin, as long as he doesn't kill every healer in the whole area and also sort of makes their body disappear or something. How do you kill a nobleman if his guy, his personal resurrection guy, is like in the same castle? Noblemen would not have to be afraid of hunting accidents, of dying in war, and so on, which would change their mindset. But such healing magic, especially raising the dead, if it's not quite as readily available, could lead to massive tension within society. For if you're a farmer and you watched your 5-year-old daughter die from some disease, and then you hear that the local lord's brat who died in some sort of riding accident because he was drunk came back to life on the next day and he's better than ever, wouldn't you consider that unfair? Would you not treat that as something that might grow hatred in your heart? And something like that happening over and over again, as I said, might lead to some significant social tension. And also, the healers themselves would probably become, weirdly enough, despised in some ways by those who cannot afford their services, or by those they do not give their services to. For which god gave those healers the power to decide who lives and who dies? And of those who die, which one comes back? Combining the healing magic and the food magic would have massive effects on society. You would have a massive explosion of population. People have a lot of food and they do not die as easily. So we'd have far more people. What that means is we would need far more space for those people. In a classic fantasy world, you have alpha predators like dragons and giants and such. These predators need a lot of land. Otherwise, their whole feeding and hunting cycle doesn't really work. Now, with humanity, or whatever race you want to use, really, pushing the boundaries, you would lead to massive conflicts, probably. And a lot of those alpha predators would very soon be gone, or at least hunted to the very edge of extinction in a lot of ways, like it happens to tigers and wolves and bears and such in our world, basically. More people means more mages, more wizards, right? It's sort of a percentage of the population that has magical powers. That's usually how it works. So the higher amount of population you have, the higher amount of wizards you have. Those wizards would start doing things that are not just the very basic things, which means that a lot of people would have to contest being non-mages with someone who can do their type of work just with a thought. Wizards, those damn wizards are stealing our jobs, right? So that's another way to have tension in society. More people also means that you need tighter government control, otherwise everything will dissolve into chaos. The more people there are, the more laws you need, the more policemen you need, and so on and so on and so on. Another little side effect of that. Communication magic and teleportation magic would drastically change the world. Goods would become far more readily available, and people would be able to keep in touch with one another, and especially important, they would be able to get to information much more easily with this sort of communications technology or magic. Basically, it would turn the world, or make the world, much smaller. Now let's talk, of course, about warfare. How would warfare change in a high magic world? Armies would become one of two things. Either there would be massive unorganized mobs that just rush the enemy and hope to overwhelm them before the mages can wipe out too many of them, or, which is more likely, armies would mostly disappear and be replaced by small, highly trained and elite teams consistent of mostly magic users, with a bunch of people there to protect the magic users and or assassinate enemy magic users. Specialists that are trained specifically for taking out magic users and wizards. These sorts of teams, they act very, very different from large armies. They need far less resources and they are far more mobile, especially if you add flying and teleportation magic and such. The battlefields would probably become non-existent, for if you can teleport into the enemy king's bedchambers and burn everyone there and destroy the whole castle, why do you need a battlefield? Warfare would become very chaotic as everyone would try to wrestle for control. Castles would probably become non-existent, for if magic is so prevalent, what use is there for a stone wall? Castles might turn into smaller versions, kind of like magic-protected bunkers, hidden away so that the enemy cannot find them, so that the king can sleep there in peace or something like that. But it goes further than this. Because mages would dominate warfare, every nation would want to have the most powerful mages. And this would start a cold war of wizards. So every nation would use their mages, like the US and the Soviet Union used the threat of the atomic bomb. But mages are much more useful than an atomic bomb because they are much more flexible. Not only can they make large-scale destruction, they can also have focused destruction, and they can also do creation, not just destruction. So having the most powerful mage does not only mean you can destroy the opponent, but it also means that you can construct your kingdom much faster and much more easily than someone without that specific mage. Basically, every realm would have magic academies that would be like Hogwarts on steroids. But every single person would have to go there to get their magic training and to have mandatory tests to determine whether this person is gifted or not. And then after that, they would be drilled and trained mercilessly to become the strongest and most powerful and most useful to their realm that they can be. But it would go even further than that. I wouldn't be surprised if very soon people would realize, oh, okay, so there are more mages in magic families. Let's do breeding programs. Let's force, if we can anyway, the mages to reproduce only with one another, thus bringing forth more and more magic users, and continue that for several hundreds of years or so, then the population percentage that are magic users would grow more and more. Because so many resources are focused on magic, of understanding it, of using it, of figuring out the best way to do so, what would happen very soon, within a few decades or centuries at the most, we would have an industrial revolution of magic, basically. Like an evolution of sciences in our world, magic would evolve. People would seek to understand it and come to understand it more and more. You would have more and more specialized mages that become so good in their craft that mages from 100 years before that would never understand or be able to reproduce what these people are doing. In such a society, without fail, you would have massive injustice and discrimination. Hell, in our world, we could say that most people are sort of equally skilled, right? Someone has their strengths here, the other person has their strengths there, and most of us are like on a more or less equal skill level. In a world where some people can change reality with just a thought and others can't, you do not have that. So inequality is real, and it would be even stronger in a society. If you know that you are better than your fellow people, and if you can easily destroy them if you want to, who's to stop you from being arrogant and taking control? The presence of high magic would most likely lead to massive social unrests, massive tensions between those who can use magic and those who cannot. After all, even in our medieval Europe, with no real magic as far as we know, there were witch hunts and paranoia and such. Now imagine that whole thing in a society where you know that people can use magic because you have seen them fly and chuck fireballs and teleport and so on and so on. Magic, illusion magic, mind control magic, magic that can kill without anyone being the wiser, because the killing, the weapon, so to speak, is invisible in a way to people who cannot perceive magic. All that would turn society into a massively paranoid one. Anything that happens, any accident and such, would most likely, at least by those who do not have magic, be blamed on the magic users. I mean, sure, maybe my son fell off the horse, but maybe the neighboring baron actually paid the magic user to throw him off the horse without anyone realizing it and cracking open his skull, or stuff like that. Because of that mass paranoia and that blaming, there would be witch hunts, there would be regulations, very strict ones probably, but how do you enforce those regulations? How do you stop people from doing something when they have powers that you cannot control and that you cannot stop, really? Well, you stop them and you regulate them by using your own wizards. And in that way, every single realm, within decades or centuries at the most, would turn into a magocracy. A place where the mages, the most powerful ones that is, are in charge, officially by taking the titles of king and emperor and such, or unofficially by standing behind the thrones of kings and emperors, whispering in their ears and forcing them to obey their own will. But it would go even further than that. If you have nearly godlike powers, it would not take very long until you are perceived by the people around you as a god, or until you perceive yourself as a god. After all, mages can destroy cities with their minds, and then they can raise the inhabitants of those cities back to life if they desire, with just a single wish. Also, there would be personality cults, very strong ones, gathered around the most arrogant and the most charismatic of such wizards. In fact, there would probably even be god pretenders, people that can come back from the dead, even if you chop them into pieces, burn them, and throw their ashes into the river. With magic like in some D&D games, clone and simulacrum and all those sorts of things, wizards are practically immortal. And how long will it take for someone to figure out, with our industrial evolution of magic going on, the secret of becoming truly immortal, as in stopping the aging process of their bodies, or finding out how to switch from one body to the other? And then, with a lot of wizards in the population, a lot of mages, and some of them becoming so powerful, things would become very interesting, and things would also move so far away from our familiar medieval European-ish setting that, as I said, things would be hardly recognizable for us. Do we want that? Probably not. But it is an interesting thought experiment to go through, and now you can probably see what I meant when I said it is a spiral starting at the center and just going out and out and out of control. So hopefully this video was inspirational for you and made you think, and probably gave you another way of looking at magic when you create your own magic systems or use ones that other people have created. As always, if you enjoyed our content, feel free to like this video and subscribe to our channel. There will be a button probably somewhere up here where you can subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments if there is a topic that you would like me to talk about in the next episode of GM Musings. And as always, until we see each other again, True Mask Games says thank you for watching, good luck with your own games, and bye-bye.